Hello. I hope I'm going to be introducing a guest we're very happy to have. This is the August 6th, 2020 program of UN This Week. I'm your host, Adam Carroll, of human rights organization called Justice for All that stands up for the persecuted minority populations around the world, especially facing marginalization, persecution, and genocide. Today, remembering not only the victims of countless wars and conflicts, disease and despair, but to start off specifically the victims of the US nuclear bombing in 1945. Today is the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, killing 140,000 men, children, and women in that city alone, half of them obliterated instantly. Yesterday's shocking explosion in Beirut can serve as yet another visual reminder of the wide ripple effect of devastation and loss. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to read a poem sent out today by Rabbi Arthur Waskow of the Shalom Center. It's called Between the Fires. We are the generation that stands between the fires. Behind us, the flame and smoke that rose from Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and from the burning Amazon. Before us, the nightmare of a flood of fire, the flame and smoke that could consume all earth. It is our task to make from fire not an all-consuming blaze, but the light in which we see each other fully. All of us different, all of us bearing one spark. We light these candle fires to see more clearly that earth and all who live as part of it are not for burning. We light these fires to see more clearly the rainbow in our many-colored faces. Blessed is the one within the many. Blessed are the many who make one. So on today's show, we hope to shed some light on the healing process, including at the UN and international courts, with our guest, Dr. Yael Danieli, an international renowned therapist whose work with Holocaust survivors broke through the conspiracy of silence around trauma, resulting from mass murder, as well as physical and cultural genocides. Let me check in with my producer. Yes, good, Dr. Danieli. I'm going to give you a slightly lengthy intro. Dr. Danieli is a clinical psychologist in private practice, a victimologist, traumatologist, and the director of the Group Project for Holocaust Survivors and Their Children, which he co-founded here in New York City 45 years ago. She is also founder, International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. Dr. Danieli is past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She has taught at Seton Hall, Brooklyn College, and John Jay College, lectured and published worldwide in numerous books and journals, and received many awards and recognitions. At the half-hour point of the show, we will also welcome onto the show our colleague from the NGO Committee for Human Rights, Gina Damasco, with experience in trauma-informed lawyering on behalf of trafficking victims. Gina has hosted many committees, both at the UN and in New Jersey, and joins our show despite the impact of the hurricane on her town yesterday. But speaking of the United Nations, Dr. Danieli is a point person for the United Nations on numerous issues and has worked with Holocaust survivors, genocide survivors in Rwanda, Truth and Reconciliation tribunals in South Africa, and Bosnian victims of genocide. She has been deeply engaged in UN victim-related work, including the right to reparation. Dr. Danieli has been senior representative to the United Nations of the World Federation of Mental Health, also the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the International Organization for Victims Assistance, as well as serving as vice chair of the Executive Committee for Non-Governmental Organizations, and the list goes on, including UN crime prevention, including the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention, and also consultant to the WHO, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Danieli.
Thank you, dear.
You and I first met after 9/11, and there was this book that you were working on and you helped produce. And I was very glad to be part of it, one of many, many voices that wrote chapters about the impact of the disaster, of the terror attack on the World Trade Center. I was wondering if you might just say a few words of how you came to this book.
Well, having participated until that point in all the United Nations work on behalf of victims' rights and victims' care, when the planes hit, and I saw it from my terrace, I had the same feeling of protectiveness and caring for New York and for the United States, and felt that the United States can gain from the knowledge gleaned around the world on the aftermath of terrorist attacks on victims. So the first thing I did was to create this book, The Trauma of Terrorism, which was Sharing Knowledge and Shared Care, an international handbook. But the United States was not, at that time, was very much preoccupied with itself. So it looked like it better learned from its own experience. So I decided to do the second book, which you so kindly participated in, which is called On the Ground After September 11th. Not everywhere, but here in New York, in Pennsylvania, in DC. And here we focused on the mental health responses and practical knowledge gained. And indeed, as I did with previous books that I did for the United Nations, I did 3 of them. We can talk about that in a little bit. I did not only include, as you know, chapters and guides, that is ways to recommend to people to behave or not to in order to protect themselves and perhaps heal and perhaps prevent victimization from happening again, but also voices of actual human beings, of all the amazing diversity of New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, and the United States as a whole. Indeed, to give voice to all, which has been what I've done basically all my life, really. And still am doing. We can talk about that later too.
Well, maybe just stepping back.
Sorry?
Yeah, just. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But just stepping back, how did you first come to this kind of work? You've been doing it for quite some time, and wondered how did you start? I
started when I was working on my doctorate in psychology, the first doctorate, on the psychology of hope. And I was teaching at Brooklyn College at the time. Yes, I really wanted to know. It was in sort of middle of the second half of the 20th century. I sort of wanted to try to figure out what, I see, I can do this. Now you see me better.
Yeah.
I'm figuring it out. Sorry, people. I was trying to figure out why stay around in such a horrible, what seemed like a horrible century that took the lives of so many in such inhumane ways. So I assigned what looked like the easy cases to my students. So, for example, some of my students hung out in bus stops and interviewed people about having just missed a bus. So that seemed to be a minimal challenge to hope. But you see, sometimes you miss a bus, you lose your job. So my students very quickly learned that everything just seems to be really, we should really keep an open mind to what people consider challenging and important. And of course, my disabled students interviewed the disabled, divorced, those who were left back in classes, etc. And I took upon myself what seemed to be the most extreme cases, which was Holocaust survivors, POWs or prisoners of war, and people who have been diagnosed with terminal illnesses. I can tell we can have a whole show just on that, but we're not going to, because what's important in answering your question was that it was very interesting. This was in the mid-60s and beginning 70s, and everybody discouraged me from speaking to survivors of the Holocaust, to terminally ill patients and their families, etc. Quotes under the heading of "Don't talk to them; they don't talk to anybody. Why do you think they'll talk to you?" So, and I also believe in studying where things happen, not, let's say, only in my office or in a laboratory. So, and at the time, Yafa Eliach, a colleague at Brooklyn College, at the same time, Dr. Ruth was also working at Brooklyn College at the time, another survivor. Yafa started the first center to study the Holocaust. And so from her, I asked permission of Holocaust survivors to speak with them. And typically, I would come to their homes after work, and they would seek me in the kitchen. And more often than not, I couldn't leave until the next day, because they did not only not speak, of course they spoke, but it's like they couldn't stop. And it was that they were actually waiting for someone to truly want to listen. And part of what they told me was how many times people wouldn't listen to them, and in fact, ways of shutting them up. And worse than that, not just people or friends or neighbors, but they would go to psychotherapy or to other professionals, or medical doctors, legal professionals, etc. And they too would not ask them questions about their experiences, or when they would talk about it, they would sort of find ways to also not listen. And I was a very idealistic graduate student, believing that my upcoming profession was the right calling. And to hear that even my own colleagues wouldn't listen, right people I admire. I changed the topic of my dissertation, but I did publish some about the psychology of hope, but I changed the topic to study systematically what I called, did too, the conspiracy of silence about Holocaust experiences. And I interviewed all trained psychoanalysts around the world who knew that they were treating Holocaust survivors. Because, if you don't ask and you don't listen, you don't even know. So it was really interesting that I found 62 such people and interviewed them to understand what makes people not listen, and how they don't listen. And I learned a great deal. I learned 49 ways of not listening.
Wow.
49 ways. We are amazing. Human beings are amazing non-listeners, especially when it comes to trauma. And not only massive trauma, but especially when it comes to trauma. And
I was wondering, is it mainly fear that is behind the screening that people do and the objectification of the other? I mean, is that what is? It's a distancing mechanism, or is it everything?
it is 49 different ways. I did publish it a lot, and it's worth reading. So you help yourself open your ears and your mind and your heart. Not just
Yes.
make it easy. It's not only fear and extreme anxiety. It is also guilt, bystanders' guilt. It is also rage that you don't have another way to express. So you don't know where to put it, and you run away from it, or you attack the survivor, actually, because the survivor is the messenger. There are all kinds of ways. As I said, there are 49 complex ways. Some of the issues have to do with feeling too intensely. So it's not only about what you feel, but feeling it, so much of it that you cannot contain it. So you have to run. So it's both experiencing certain threatening emotions and the intensity of the emotions. And indeed, we started advocating special training for people to confront their own trauma, so they're able to integrate not only their own trauma, but the trauma that they're listening to. And it became also a moral issue because, of course, while society has a moral obligation to listen and be there for its members, psychotherapists, lawyers, police, etc., clergy, all professionals that interface with survivors have the professional obligation to listen, the contractual obligation, because if they don't listen, they can't help, they can't understand, and they can't help. So that too became a major issue. And when we speak about giving voice to survivors or opening the door for their voice to come out, that's part of what stands in the way, right? The listener must be there for the voice to be heard, not only to be uttered. So,
now, what about the UN then? Because you've been involved with the United Nations for quite some time.
It's all related. It's all related.
Yeah.
Because for me, immersing myself in Holocaust work was never just about the Holocaust itself. It was also about having to teach the world about it, and also having to teach the lessons. Because I was totally convinced that survivors of other human-made disasters and other disasters and catastrophes must have some similarities, or they might gain from what we've learned. So indeed, it all is connected, because I'll tell you how I got into the UN. In 1979, as usual, there was the meeting of a huge professional organization, I would not specify, here in New York City. And there was, our proposal was rejected because they said that our methodology did not concur with, I still have that letter, actually. It's on that old purple fax machine, you remember that? They called it methodology. What can you do? But at any rate, I did attend nonetheless, and there was only one session on victims. And it had to do with Vietnam veterans, rape victims, more victims of crime, and veterans of wars. and they were presenting, and then they said, but we don't know what to do. And I said, actually, we do. And we created the first scientific committee on the mental health of victims in the World Federation for Mental Health. And I had the profound honor to chair it. At the same time, so this is 79, 80, that's beginning 80s, At the same time, in the UN context, for the first time in history, after the Sixth Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, there was a movement to acknowledge the rights of victims. And it was really of crime, but we insisted also on abuse of power. And a woman by the name of Irene Mella, whose picture is there because she's always lighting my way, although my heart is always saddened not to have her now anymore. Irene invited us, all of us, to work on that very first United Nations Declaration on, come on, I know, United Nations Declaration on the rights for, well, it was on victims' rights, victims of crime and abuse of power. Actually, it was of principles of justice for victims of crime and abuse of power. And indeed, in the Seventh Congress in Italy, in Milano, it was agreed upon by consensus, and by November of that year, or September, the GA of the following year, it became adopted by consensus as a United Nations instrument. And so this is exactly the leap. It was exactly the leap. Everything I learned led me to believe that victims have the right. And part of my insistence, not only there, but also in the Convention for the Rights of the Child or many other United Nations instruments, it was very clear that mental health was absent, that the understanding of trauma was absent. So, for example, for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, with many colleagues, as I always do, we created the first book, which is called International Responses to Traumatic Stress, to in fact humbly teach the UN that according to the UN Charter, we are here to prevent succeeding generations from the scourge of war, etc., really from the scourge of traumas. So we created the first book on that. When I came to the UN in the 80s, at the beginning, the word mental health was nowhere to be found. The word trauma was no psychological, emotional, none of that was in any UN document. I am profoundly, profoundly satisfied that today, even the Security Council talks in a full whole human level experience of human experience, rather than just be staunch old ways. And so, and Boutros Ghali, to his great wisdom, adapted this as one of the 50th anniversary book, and he wrote the epilogue to the book. Then, for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we created, with Elsa Stamatopoulou and others, we created the book for the 50th anniversary. But that's where we began, with the chapters, guides, and voices. We have, because the question of that book was really not just to review all the human rights, because that exists in many shelves of many people, but to ask each one of the writers, have the human right, do victims know that they have rights? Have the rights reach the victims? Because after all, it's not only for college classes. This was extraordinary. Mary Robinson was then the High Commissioner, and she loved it too. And we are blessed to still have her and her wisdom on so many other issues. And then, in fact, part of what we learned, to go back to the conspiracy of silence and the specialized training, we learned that it's not only the victim, him or herself, or the family, etc., who are suffering, but that the listener does too. And actually, that is why the listener, right, tries to escape. The listener is either afraid to be hurt or is hurt and run because it's too much.
Well, that's something that the UN can't afford to do, is run away. And
Wait. So then that's why not only did I create the seminars, etc., to teach others, but also my third book, for and on behalf of the United Nations, is called Sharing the Front Lines in the Black Hills. It covers the experiences of humanitarian workers, peacekeepers, media, journalists, justice workers out there, and the toll it takes upon them to be in the midst of injustice and to listen to the bearers of injustice, which is the victims. Meanwhile, in 92, I want you to understand that the world, like to remind everybody, not so much to understand. World War II ended 76 years ago now, right? But in 1945, it wasn't until 1985 that victims had their international rights. 40 years.
Wow.
It wasn't until 2005 that the United Nations finally created what we call the remedy resolution, that is the rights of victims to reparations. Very important resolution that we should be extremely proud of. And it wasn't until we created the International Criminal Court that we truly progressed the cause of victims, not only about justice, but within the justice system. That is, victims there have the right to participate. They have the right to reparations. They have the right to protection. And they have a trust fund for victims, which was my personal dream, I must delightfully say.
Well, reparative justice as a concept and as a practice is so important. And the ICC, though it's attacked by Donald Trump, but others as well, it all seems that the UN is under some kind of under siege. But you have been one of the people who have really built up the UN to buttress and strengthen the architecture of rights, of intellectual foundations for serving those who are suffering and who are targeted. One of the issues that my NGO works on is the Rohingya genocide in Burma. And so we're very aware that the hope that the international courts offer is somewhat tenuous but real, and that the impacted community does cry for justice, as it does all over the world. And so we really applaud all those efforts of you and your colleagues. I wanted to ask about some of the organizations that you've been representing. There's one which is, if we could put up the link, I think it's there's this one, and then there's one more too, which is the IOVA. If you could say something about what these victims assistance groups, International Organization of Victims Assistance.
Yeah.
Yes.
They indeed, the creators of IOVA participated in creating the declaration. They have been working. They have been working on helping victims around the world indeed fulfill their rights. That's right. The World Federation for Mental Health. It's the largest federations around the world of mental health workers, including, quotes, consumers, including the rights of those who suffer as well. So I always, I've always been involved in activities and organizations that include all of the faces of the problem. And the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, yes, I was one of the founders. I had the honor of being the first woman president, of which I'm very, very proud. By far, now we have more women president than men in the history, which is fun. Um, and the most important baby to me now, from my own legacy, is the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. I created the handbook, the International Handbook for that, in 1998. It's still the main handbook in the area. Again, reached out to at least 30 populations around the world covered here. As I said, my interest was always to learn about everyone and to create comparative knowledge and mutual benefit from what we learned from each other. As I approached 80, and God still kept me here, I said, okay, it's time to create, as we did, the first scientifically valid questionnaire instrument to assess multi-generational legacies of trauma. So in effect, we can measure it, and when we apply for reparations, we can prove factually, scientifically, that one ought to have it, not just to come as the good-hearted NGO is believing that one should compensate for one's crimes, as we have done many years in the past. And to create the International Center. So I created the Danieli Inventory for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, and the center that has the book in full for free. So please go read it there. We have a library of all professions that try to describe trauma, be it theater, be it legal writings, historic writings, film, poetry, any human endeavor that expands and deepens our understanding of multi-generational legacies of trauma. And indeed, I believe that again now the UN is starting to get it.
Well, that's a good moment to take our station break. We have a 15-second station break, and we'll be right back. This is UN This Week with Dr. Yael Danieli. We'll be right back. Okay. Now we're back. This is Adam Carroll, and we're speaking with Dr. Yael Danieli, and we're going to bring on another guest now to join our conversation, Gina Damasco, who is active with the Unitarian Universalists, and she is calling from hurricane-torn northern New Jersey, but here she is. Gina, you have been working on some of the related issues, especially trauma-informed lawyering around human trafficking and other issues. So I was wondering if you might just have a response to what you've been listening to.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this call, on this program, and I'm hopeful that you can hear me. We are a little challenged with our signal here. And Dr. Danieli, I am in awe of all the amazing work that you have done. It's extraordinary. So the work that I've done, I've been an attorney for about 20 years, the majority of which has been doing civil rights and human rights. I would say that my first real meaningful encounter, well, in law school, I was on the special ed litigation clinic where we worked with, where we represented students who had been sort of mistreated and neglected in education. They were denied an education. And so that was sort of my first touch point dealing with that as a student. And later on, I went to work as a civil rights attorney for the federal government and a mediator in the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And in that work, over the years, I think it was mostly the mediator work that really started to help me not just do the work sort of from an external point of view, which a lot of people do, but work with people who, vulnerable populations, vulnerable individuals who've experienced significant trauma, mainly because the way in which this office worked was people didn't need attorneys. They would file directly with our agency, and we would have direct communication. We would assist them in boiling down what their concerns were into allegations and potential legal issues for investigation. And in doing that, there were you would see the differences between how people were able to work through this. Some people would, essentially develop like a hardened shell. Some of the, my colleagues, or they would, look at it more of a procedural, point of view, and didn't really get personal. And then others of us would get really burnt out. We'd get very close. One of the most notable examples was where I had a little girl who was 6. She was African American in a white working class neighborhood, and somebody pushed her, a little boy who's 6, who was white, pulled down her pants, pushed her face first onto the ground, and simulated sex on her by calling her the N-word and then spit on her. And this was my case, and I had to do the interview of her. And I remember the feelings that it evoked and how incredibly sort of unnerving this was. And we didn't have any easy cases. I mean, some maybe not quite as severe seeming, to at least to, on paper, than others. But, the impact of this over years, and then particularly working in the role of a mediator and trying to help, we would try to get essentially the school who was alleged to have violated the civil rights of students, and then the students themselves, to come together and work out a peaceable resolution. And oftentimes in that particular circumstance is when we would realize that it was a lot deeper than just, I want this, it's a dollar exchange or whatever. And it wasn't until sort of later that I started working with human trafficking survivors and got training in, through, I think the Polaris Project might have been related to one of the trainings. This was with Volunteer Lawyers for Justice in Newark, where I did pro bono work as well, with human trafficking clients. That I started to really appreciate what it meant to not only deal with somebody who's gone through a severely traumatic experience, and how different their responses were, and how it impacted the way in which we were able to do our work, but also the experience that we had through secondary or vicarious trauma. And that's notwithstanding the individual experiences of trauma that we may bring to the situation. Like, if, for example, you were, you never disclosed that you were a victim of sexual violence, and you're working on sexual violence cases, for example. So these things can then sort of compound. And what you sort of learn through that process, which lawyers don't really talk about, right? So I not only worked in sort of the public interest civil rights spectrum, but I also worked for a fairly large law firm in New Jersey, representing clients like institutions, and do labor and employment and contracts, and then telecom. And these seem very sort of disassociated from one another. But the one thing that nobody talks about is the impact of the work and working with not only individuals who have experienced significant trauma, but the way in which how it impacts you and what you bring to the table. And one of the
I was
things
wondering if I could just intervene, because I'm
Sure.
watching the clock. I think that's very interesting. And to talk about secondary trauma, I was wondering if Dr. Danieli could also bring that into relate to the United Nations system, which you know very well, Gina, as well. There's the book.
Right. I'm sure I've come across it doing research. So
it's one of them.
I know.
I mean, years ago, people didn't talk much about PTSD, and now there's quite a lot of talk about PTSD. I don't know if there's a lot of understanding of it, but how it affects journalists, how it affects, as you're saying, lawyers. I have to say, I never thought about how it affects lawyers until this moment. So, that I stand corrected.
Well, one of the things I think maybe Dr. Danieli, it would be great for you to sort of talk about as well. The current pandemic that we're in has raised sort of this additional layer. So now, so let's just keep this to, for example, the human rights defenders and advocates, which are most closely aligned with this discussion. Although my theory and the work that I want to bring to the fore is that it should be across all aspects of lawyering. It should be integrated through all aspects, because you take your client as you find them, and just because they come looking to sell a house doesn't mean they're selling a house because they didn't lose their entire family due to COVID, for example, and they're actually somebody who's experienced serious trauma. And how are you going to work with that productively as an attorney? But that notwithstanding, I think in this particular case, we have very significant challenges that are being posed, because human rights defenders who are, say, located in the United States are experiencing the trauma of surviving the pandemic, right? They may be losing family members, may be at risk of losing family members. Their own health may be in jeopardy or at risk. They have travel restrictions, and then the people they serve are oftentimes located very far away. There's difficulty reaching them. We have now the destabilization of what used to be foreign diplomacy mechanisms from say, for the U.S. is just the greatest example, thanks to nationalism, where the pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council, the attacks on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have all of this degradation of the systems in place that worked on a good day, and now you add the layers of the lack of foreign diplomacy, and then further you add the fact that the people that you're serving and yourself are now also dealing with the extra stress and trauma. And so part of the issues are acknowledging this, because I know from my own personal experience, one of my responses was, we're not doing enough. How can I look at what I'm dealing with? I'm living a life of privilege compared to the people I'm serving. I have no right to examine the impact, the secondary or vicarious trauma that I'm experiencing, let alone, so there's no right, in my mind to do that. And there isn't really sort of the understanding and appreciation that you have to put the mask on yourself before you can put the mask on someone else, as they say in an airplane. That there's it not only undermines your ability to perform at your best by counterintuitively taking self-care measures to properly address the secondary trauma and PTSD for your own direct individual traumas, but then also understanding its greater impact on the community in which you serve. So, for example, human rights attorneys, there's a high turnover of public interest in human rights attorneys because of the high level of burnout, for this very reason, because it's go at 100% and forget that you're also human and need to take care of yourself.
So I was wondering, where are we now? Because we have about three more minutes before we have to end. So I think these are really important. I wanted to give Dr. Danieli a chance to respond, especially about the UN, where we are with COVID-19, with all these layers that have just been described. And is the idea of doing more? Is it doing less? What is needed?
I would be remiss. First of all, thank you for what you said, because you're so absolutely right. One of the most passionate, emotional speeches I gave internationally, and it's available, I can send it to you, is about human rights defenders, and not only human rights defenders, but the defenders of all of us during COVID. But I want to add something that connects sort of much of what we're talking about and adds a bit. On the first day of COVID, I had the same kind of awakening I had on 9/11, with the same kind of feeling. The first time I heard the words sheltering in place, I could visualize two major things. One is all the vulnerable people who will be closed in, trapped within the spaces that they're supposed to be sheltered, that is protected by from the COVID. They would be vulnerable to abuse, neglect, and violence in those sheltered places. And so I immediately, in my little ways, started a working group on domestic and family violence, and in the COVID-19 era, to do with everyone, with victims, with the UN, with the governments, with NGOs. And I invite both of you and everybody else you know to please join in with us. We are going to have an international virtual summit, November 18 to 20. These are the last days of the Action Days for Children, and in advance of the Action Days against violence against women that end on Human Rights Day, right? So November 18 to 20, we are going to hold, a 3-day meeting. As I said, we are going to have as many victim survivors' voices as we can, government representatives, United Nations representative, and I must commend the Secretary General for his voice on these issues and many related issues now. He's been really the voice of what the major concerns are. And I'm not only grateful, but very impressed, and hope he'll participate in our summit, because it is for all. And of course, part of the summit will include the impact of the victimization stories we hear from those victims, be it women, children, elderly, disabled, chronically ill, LGBTQ, and others who, because they are locked in place, I'm even afraid to use the word shelter anymore, but because they're locked in place, they are in more danger, not only from COVID, but from human violence. And furthermore, and this connects to your question in terms of the context, the UN context of this, and not only the UN, but many governments. Part of what's still wrong is the structural system. That is, particularly when you look at a home, there's a UN body specialized for women, a UN body specialized for children, a UN body specialized for the disabled, a UN body specializing on elderly, and etc., etc. But they're all in the same home. So so what COVID has exposed about the nature of humanity in general, and about many of the dangers we've been facing that are existential threats to generations to come, for which my center is totally committed. It also exposed the wrongness of this disparate silos that don't talk to each other, that don't learn from each other, that don't understand that the one dynamic is related to the other, directly related to this, etc. So part of the reason for the summit is not only to bring in the voices and all the knowledge we have accumulated and the experiences we've been accumulating, but to emphasize in no uncertain terms the failure of thinking of humanity and of human beings in silos. I know that it's part of quote modern thinking in many ways, but it ends up not only against the holistic approach, an integrative approach, but simply human approach.
Well, I hope that the UN, instead of taking a bureaucratic approach, will take that human approach, at least in debate. And I think that the summit sounds like a very necessary and interesting project. And perhaps as we get closer to November, we can have another show and also post a link to the summit. And also, Gina Damasco, I know that you are working on a very interesting research project about frontline workers and the way that that COVID-19 has impacted them. And you've also been really trying to honor their voices, very much in line with what Dr. Danieli has done in some of her work. So I think it would be great to have a future show. But I do see that we've got to stop. And so I enjoyed having you both on. And even though you might think that this is a depressing subject of victims and their suffering, we're talking about resilience, and we're talking about recognition and rights. And so these are certainly opportunities for hope. And so that brings us back to hope, which I hope springs eternal. So again, thank you, everybody. And we will see everyone next time, next show.